Hello and welcome to this section on valuation. The valuation section of your exam is going to be one of the more challenging sections of the test, and here we're going to take a look at a variety of ways of how to value a company, whether it be based on its PE ratio, its enterprise value, or its equity value. And we're going to examine how to calculate all of these values, as well as work through how an analyst or investment banker may use these valuation techniques to determine whether or not a merger and acquisition should go through. So let's jump in here, and we'll start off with a valuation or a ratio most of us are familiar with, and that is the PE ratio, or the price earnings ratio. The PE ratio is measuring the value of the stock relative to its earnings per share. And it's a very simple calculation. It's the price of the stock divided by the earnings per share. But what most people don't know, or a lot of people don't know, is that there are many different ways to calculate the PE ratio. When someone says the PE of a stock is 14 or 15, for example, it's important to understand which earnings they are using in calculating that PE ratio. They could be using the trailing earnings for the last 12 months. They could be using projected earnings for the next 12 months, or they could be basing that PE ratio on what are known as normalized earnings. And we're going to take a look at each methodology as we move through the PE ratio review. Now here we have an example of XYZ trading at $50 per share, and the earnings per share for XYZ are $4. And working through the PE ratio calculation, we see that the stock is trading at a PE of 12.5. Now, there are a number of ways you could be asked to calculate the PE ratio, and sometimes they will give you different pieces of information. In our previous example, it was very simple because they gave you the price and the earnings per share, but they could give you different data and ask you to work through the calculation accordingly. And here we have an example where we are given the net income for a company, the number of shares outstanding, and the market capitalization for the company, and we're asked to determine the PE ratio. Well, there's several ways you can calculate this, and we'll start off with the long way, and then we'll give you the kind of shortcut, and feel free to use whichever method you are most comfortable with. Now, we have net income of $5 million and 10 million shares outstanding. So the first thing we need to do here is calculate the earnings per share. $5 million divided by 10 million shares. The earnings per share in this example are 50 cents. The next thing we need to do is calculate the stock price, and the stock price here is unknown. But to calculate the stock price, we simply need to take the market capitalization of the stock, which we are provided, and divide it by the number of shares outstanding. So here in our example, we see that the market capitalization is $100 million. We have 10 million shares outstanding, and we do the math and we see that the stock is trading at $10 per share. From here, it's very easy to calculate the PE ratio. We have the earnings per share of 50 cents, and we have the price of the stock at $10. $10 divided by 50 cents, we see that the PE ratio of this stock is indeed 20. Now, there is an alternative way to calculate the PE ratio given the information we have here. We could simply take the market capitalization of the stock, which is $100 million, and divide it by the net income of $5 million. So $100 million divided by $5 million, and we end up with that same PE of 20. Now, let's take a look at how we can calculate a potential stock price given certain pieces of information. And here we have, once again, XYZ trading at $50 per share, and it earned $4 per share. Well, the PE ratio is 12.5 in this case. Now, we're given the hypothetical example that this company is expecting to grow earnings per share by 7%, and we are asked to calculate a potential stock price. So what we need to do here is we need to take the earnings per share of $4 and multiply them by the growth rate, which is 1.07, and we see that our projected earnings in this case are $4.28. We then take the PE ratio of 1250 and we multiply it by our projected earnings of $4.28. And based on this information, an analyst would predict or project that the stock should be trading at $53.50. Now, let's take a look at the use of forward PE ratios. The first thing you want to keep in mind with forward PEs is the fact that the market tends to look forward. It doesn't look behind or backwards. If you've ever been on an earnings call or read an earnings report and noticed that a company reported record earnings and record profits, but for some reason the stock price in the market had fallen, perhaps dramatically, well, the most likely reason for that is the company said that the coming up quarters or year isn't going to be so hot. And as a result, the stock price had fallen in the marketplace because those earnings to be generated in the future are going to be lower than what analysts expected. Now, different analysts looking at the same company may come up with very different estimates for the forward earnings of a corporation. So one analyst may be modeling for $3 per share in earnings, and another analyst looking at the same company may be modeling for $2.50 in earnings. Who knows which is right? It's very difficult to predict the future, and different analysts looking at the same company could come up with vastly different estimates. So it's hard to come up with an accurate estimate for the earnings, and therefore forward PE ratios could be somewhat off given the different estimates from analysts, and unforeseen events could preclude the corporation from meeting those estimates. Now let's take a look at another type of PE ratio, and this is known as a normalized PE ratio. And what the normalized PE ratio tries to do is to smooth out the earnings of a corporation for changes in the economy and for one-time events. They try to remove the impact of one-time events so that they get a better understanding of the actual earnings power of the corporation over a long period of time. Certain things like restructuring charges, layoffs, litigation costs, or recalls are seen as one-time events or events that do not take place every year. And in the periods where these expenses are incurred, it tends to have a substantial negative impact on the reported earnings of the company. So analysts will try to remove these items from the earnings to come up with normalized earnings, a smoothed out or an average earnings of what they expect over a longer period of time. Normalized earnings would also remove one-time positive events like the gain on a sale of an asset, because that's not really an operating activity. That's a one-time profit that the corporation realized by selling off an asset. Now let's take a look at how to calculate normalized earnings. And here we have a company going through the various stages of the business cycle. And we're looking at the period of 4 years here. And over the period of 4 years, the economy is rising and falling. And as a result, the earnings of the company are rising and falling with the business cycle. So in year one, the economy is at its best. The GDP is the highest for this particular cycle, and the company earns $4.10 per share. In the second year, we enter a recession, and the earnings fall to $2.80 a share. In the third year, the economy bottoms out, and we see that the earnings per share reach their lowest level of $2.65. And then in the fourth year, we see that the economy is starting to pick up steam, and we see the earnings begin to rise at $3.40. Now, what we're doing here is we're summing up all of the earnings over these 4-year periods, and we're dividing it by the number of periods in the observation, in this case 4. So the total earnings over this 4-year period is $12.95 divided by 4. Well, our normalized earnings per share as a result would be $3.23 per share. Now, if the stock was priced in the marketplace at $38, our normalized PE would be $38 divided by the earnings per share of $3.23, and we see that our normalized PE is 11.76. Now, when analysts calculate normalized earnings per share, they try to estimate the earnings in mid-cycle. Now, we're not going to take the earnings at the peak of the economic cycle, and we wouldn't take the earnings at the trough of the economic cycle, but somewhere in that midpoint to reflect the fact that the economy moves up and down and that the earnings of the company will be moving in line with those movements through the business cycle. All right, let's take a look at another application of the PE, and we're going to take a look at relative PE here. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the PE of a company and use it to determine if that company is relatively expensive or relatively inexpensive to the market as a whole or to an index. Now, we have two corporations, ABC and XYZ. They're both in the semiconductor space, and we're taking a look at their PEs. The PE of ABC is 28, and the PE of XYZ is 40. The semiconductor index has a PE of 31, and now we can value each corporation relative to its reference index, which is the semiconductor index. So we take the PE of our company and we divide it by the index PE. And in the case of ABC, we take a PE of 28 and divide it by 31, and we see that its relative PE is 0.9. Now we take a look at the relative PE for XYZ, and we take their PE of 40 and divide it by the market PE or the index PE of 31, and we see that its relative PE is 1.29. Now when you have a relative PE of less than 1, it indicates that the corporation may be cheap to its reference index, and when it's greater than 1, it is relatively expensive to the index. Now, one thing they could ask you to deal with on the exam is the company cheap or expensive relative to itself based on its historical premium or discount to the marketplace PE? So they could ask you, well, if ABC traditionally trades at a discount to its index, is it cheap or expensive relative to itself? And you need to be aware of this style question. So for example, if we have a PE that is, say, 1.2 relative to the index, and that company normally trades at a premium of 50% to its reference index, on a relative basis to itself, that company would be deemed to be cheap. Let me say that again for you. If a corporation's PE is normally trading at 150% of the reference index or a premium to the marketplace, and it's trading at a relative PE of 1.2 or 120% of its reference index, that company would be seen as relatively inexpensive to itself based on its historical premium. So be aware of that style concept that you may see on your exam. All right, let's take a look at additional ways to calculate the PE. What I want to point out here is that the math on this test is relatively simple. It's all addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Everybody has been doing these types of calculations since high school. Understanding how to use the information that is presented to arrive at the correct answer is what sometimes gives test takers a bit of a challenge. So we need to know how to use the data provided to come up with the unknown or the answer that they are looking for. So it may be very straightforward. It may be a little bit obscure by providing selective data, but we're going to work through all different types of scenarios that you're sure you know how to deal with these problems when it comes to test time. All right, so here we have additional ways to calculate a PE, and you can calculate the PE of a stock if you know the annual dividend, the dividend payout ratio, and the dividend yield on the stock. Now let's take a look at an example here. We have a company, SJI, and they pay an annual dividend of $2.10. The stock yields 4% and has a dividend payout of 60%, and they're asking you what the PE ratio is. Well, if we don't know how to manipulate this data, we may be very well lost in this question. But this would be a three-part calculation, and we're going to go through those for you right now. The first step would be to calculate the earnings per share. And the earnings per share would be determined by the annual dividend divided by its dividend payout ratio. Well, in the data provided, we see that the dividend is $2.10, and the corporation has a dividend payout ratio of 60%. So we know that our earnings per share are $3.50. So it's the annual dividend of $2.10 divided by that dividend payout ratio of 60%. And that's how we arrive at the earnings per share of $3.50. Now we need to figure out how to calculate the stock price. The stock price can be calculated by taking the annual dividend and dividing it by the dividend yield. Well, we see that the annual dividend, once again, is $2.10, and the stock yields 4%. So $2.10 divided by 4%, or 0.04, gives us a stock price of $52.50. Finally, we're ready to calculate our PE. We have the stock price, we have the earnings per share, and now it's a simple calculation. Stock price of $52.50 divided by the earnings per share of $3.50. We see that that PE ratio is indeed 15. So with this limited amount of information, we were able to manipulate the data and arrive at the required answer. It's also important to note that while we have three steps here up on the screen for you, each one of these steps in and of itself could be the answer to a question. So they could give you the annual dividend and the dividend payout ratio and ask you to calculate the earnings per share. And we make that calculation and we're done with the question and we move on. Or they could ask you how to calculate a stock price given an annual dividend and a dividend yield. Again, another simple calculation. We answer the question and move on. So make a note of this calculation. It's a great example of style question you will see on your test. And each one of these calculations is fair game for the basis of a question in and of itself.